I don't think they watch Love Island. I was like, you need to like understand. This is
Everyone's watching it.
this is like the kind of two extremes of like contemporary culture.
This excellent book really made me think about Britishness, and I think one of the ideas that it made me think about most was that perhaps we tend to be a little bit too self-congratulatory about the idea of Britishness as all-inclusive, that perhaps it's not as inclusive as we thought.
I certainly feel that we have been so wrapped up in celebrating the fact that we're a multicultural society, the fact that we're tolerant, and I use tolerant in quotation marks because if you think about it, it's actually a really problematic word. It suggests that there's something bad about having people who are visibly different, or other faiths and races, but we kind of put up with it. And so we've been so busy masking over some of the ideas underlying these values that we haven't actually stopped to ask whether we are including people of colour, for example, in Britishness. And my experience, certainly, and I say this as someone with a privileged life, who grew up in a middle-class area, had access to an excellent education, still felt that I was not allowed to be British in the same way that white British people were. And I think recently we've seen that really taken to extreme, where if that's something I was hypothesising, recent events have absolutely provided the evidence. Windrush people who are British, who have been working and paying taxes, who are entitled to Britishness, literally being physically deported from the country. People like me who critique these things being told we should be more grateful to be here, and if we don't like it we should leave. These populist tendencies really emboldening racists, a small and hardcore minority of racists who nevertheless seem to have a disproportionate impact on the national imagination and debate. So I feel that what went from being maybe quite a cerebral question about whether Britishness was inclusive has become something actually quite urgent about our well-being, our right to be in a country that is ours.
What you're describing, it seems to me, is an almost tiered system of citizenship, where some people have actually only a probationary or provisional citizenship, and that's a huge problem, isn't it?
I feel that very strongly. My experience is being singled out almost every day and asked different questions about my Britishness to other British people based on my colour and my visible difference. So some of these are subtle. For example, I get asked all the time where I'm from, and this is often a very well-meaning question by people who are curious, not racist, but I'm sure they don't realise the effect, which is that because of how I look, I am constantly being asked where I'm from, and when I say I'm British, I'm asked where are you really from. There is an assumption that you have an explanation to offer and that you somehow owe it. And I think that the cumulative effect of that on people who are British and don't feel they should need to explain is this unsettling, this sense of not being able to just be here without explaining or defending or justifying one's presence. And I think that combines with some of these more tangible economic and political threats to make people feel uncomfortable. That there's a whole thing for me as well around being a good immigrant, this idea that so many people of colour have expressed that you feel like you're all right as long as you don't put a foot wrong. You know, you need to do twice as much to do well and half as much to fail, that you can never afford to take a gamble on being seen like a troublemaker or someone who plays their music too loud or isn't polite. Because if you do, it will bring up all of this other baggage simmering just beneath the surface about whether you are allowed or entitled to be here in the first place. And these are things that affect people of colour differently because we are constantly being othered because of how we look.
To what extent do you think these attitudes reflect the legacy of empire that's baked into our culture in a way that perhaps we're not even aware of?
These are completely legacies of empire, and some of the narratives that stemmed out of empire. So it was an imperial project to create race. The idea of blackness was created as a juxtaposition to whiteness, blackness being an inferior racial identity. And the thing about empire is that it was incredibly effective, and after the physical boundaries of empire have dissolved, the mental intergenerational ideology has survived. This idea that British and English civilization is superior is something that many people born in the empire have they're still living the consequences of that education. They've passed it down to their children. This idea of kind of seeking approval from the British establishment being the ultimate goal. The idea of having lost one's own heritage or faith through the transatlantic slave trade. There are many black British people who do not know where their families originally came from, what part of Africa, what their faiths or ethnic groups would have been. They have the names of the slave masters who enslaved their families, many of whom are British. So these are very real things. I find it bizarre when people say this is ancient history. People are living it with it in their names and their family histories every day. Do
you think it was present, the whole idea of empire was present in one shape or form in Brexit? Is it part of it? Is it there?
The whole imperial history is related to Brexit because I think that part of the legacy of empire is the idea that there is such a thing as this English race, which has this purity associated with it, that is superior, that is about civilization, and that there is something indigenous about white Englishness, and that other people who are in this country are not really part of that project, that they're British is a kind of political identity that was created for Commonwealth people, and that they're not really the same as the English or the Welsh or the Scottish. And I think Englishness stands apart from those other national identities within the UK as having a particular ideology of racial purity attached to it. In the Brexit debate, I feel that some of it was not very subtly coded language about getting back to that state of indigeneity, this nativist populism. And that the immigration debate, which purports to be nothing to do with race, purports to be about controlling our borders, if you unpick it, is very racialised. I mean, for example, I come from southwest London, which has had a huge amount of immigration from South Africa. White South Africans, white Zimbabweans, it's often just referred to as the Biltong Belt. I have never heard anyone in southwest London complain about the impact of these tens of thousands of immigrants on jobs, housing, school places, GP surgeries. It's never perceived as a problem, even though these are immigrants with a different culture, a different language, they have their own shops. They are not perceived as a problem because they are able to assimilate into whiteness far more easily than black immigrants. And so I think that it's impossible to disentangle the immigration debate from questions about black British people who are already here. And then finally, I think in the Brexit narrative, there is an incredible amount of imperial nostalgia. This idea of Britain being a nation that can stand alone in the world. Britain never stood alone in the world. Britain had an empire, and before that it was inherently linked to the rest of Europe. Britain did not win the Second World War alone. It drew on Canadian, Australian shipping. It had thousands of troops from Africa and the Commonwealth. Britain didn't win the Napoleonic Wars alone. It had the Caribbean, which was providing the majority of its GDP at the time. It had relationships with other nations that helped defeat Napoleon. So I think that there is a lot of this very toxic nostalgia, which is ahistorical, which is not honest, but which has a powerful emotive effect for many people who like the idea of English exceptionalism and racial purity. And so that for me is a very disturbing part of the Brexit narrative.
Why has identity politics become so prevalent on left and right? Why at this particular moment in history has it become such a force?
I think all politics is about identity. I think mainstream politics in Britain is about identity. Traditionally, it was more about class and regional identities. And I think that now some of those old class structures are no longer as relevant as they were, and we are a more tribal society in the sense of people who live in cities having these real multicultural identities that don't resonate with people in other parts of the country. And huge inequality in terms of resources and infrastructure and employment. So I think that identity is an inevitable part of the political debate, and I have a real issue with people who say that when you talk about the impact of identity on one's political and social outlook, you're kind of playing identity politics. These are the experiences that inform our perspective, and the idea that you create a problem by expressing them is to me really worrying. And people do say this of me. They say I'm kind of fanning the flames of racial division by talking about my lived experience. The implication for me being that everything's fine as long as people like me are denied a voice or a platform. And that, if you think about it, is a really worrying message.